see through that?' 'The business wouldn't go on very long, I expect, without me,' returned his sister composedly. 'Don't you be a fool and provoke me, Sammy, but mind what you're doing, and do it.' Sampson Brass, who was at heart in great fear of his sister, sulkily bent over his writing again, and listened as she said: 'If I determined that the clerk ought not to come, of course he wouldn't be allowed to come. You know that well enough, so don't talk nonsense.' Mr Brass received this observation with increased meekness, merely remarking under his breath that he didn't like that kind of joking, and that Miss Sally would be a much better fellow if she forbore to aggravate him. To this compliment Miss Sally replied that she had a relish for the amusement, and had no intention to forego its gratification. Mr Brass not caring, as it seemed, to pursue the subject any further, they both plied their pens at a great pace, and there the discussion ended. While they were thus employed, the window was suddenly darkened, as by some person standing close against it. As Mr Brass and Miss Sally looked up to ascertain the cause, the top sash was nimbly lowered from without, and Quilp thrust in his head. 'Hello!' he said, standing on tiptoe on the window sill and looking down into the room. 'Is there anybody at home? Is there any of the devil's ware here? Is Brass at a premium, eh?' 'laughed the lawyer in an affected ecstasy. 'Oh, very good, sir. Oh, very good indeed. Quite eccentric. Dear me, what humour he has!' 'Is that my Sally?' croaked the dwarf, ogling the fair Miss Brass. 'Is it justice with the bandage off her eyes, and without the sword and scales? Is it the strong arm of the law? Is it the Virgin of Bevis?' 'What an amazing flow of spirits!' cried Brass. 'Upon my word, it's quite extraordinary.' 'Open the door,' said Quilp. 'I've got him here. Such a clerk for you, Brass. Such a prize. Such an ace of trumps. Be quick and open the door, or if there's another lawyer near, and he should happen to look out of the window, you'll snap him up before your eyes, he will.' It is probable that the loss of the phoenix of clerks, even to a rival practitioner, would not have broken Mr Brass's heart, but, pretending great alacrity, he rose from his seat, and going to the door, returned, introducing his client, who led by the hand no less a person than Mr Richard Swiveller. 'There she is,' said Quilp, stopping short at the door, and wrinkling up his eyebrows as he looked towards Miss Sally. 'There is the woman I ought to have married. There is the beautiful Sarah. There is the female who has all the charms of her sex, and none of their weaknesses. Oh, Sally, Sally!' To this amorous address, Miss Brass briefly responded, 'Bother!' 'Hard-hearted as the metal from which she takes her name,' said Quilp. 'Why don't she change it, melt down the brass, and take another name?' 'Hold your nonsense, Mr Quilp, do,' returned Miss Sally with a grim smile. 'I wonder you're not ashamed of yourself before a strange young man.' 'The strange young man,' said Quilp, handing Dick Swiveller forward, 'is too susceptible himself not to understand me well. This is Mr Swiveller, my intimate friend, a gentleman of good family and great expectations, but who, having rather involved himself by youthful indiscretion, is content for a time to fill the humble station of a clerk. Humble, but here most enviable. What a delicious atmosphere!' If Mr Quilp spoke figuratively, and meant to imply that the air breathed by Miss Sally Brass was sweetened and rarefied by that dainty creature, he had doubtless good reason for what he said. But if he spoke of the delights of the atmosphere of Mr Brass's office in a literal sense, he had certainly a peculiar taste, as it was of a close and earthy kind, and, besides being frequently impregnated with strong whiffs of the second-hand wearing apparel exposed for sale in Duke's Place and Houndsditch, had a decided flavour of rats and mice and a taint of mouldiness. Perhaps some doubts of its pure delight presented themselves to Mr Swiveller, as he gave vent to one or two short abrupt sniffs, and looked incredulously at the grinning dwarf.
'Mr Swiveller,' said Quilp, 'being pretty well accustomed to the agricultural pursuits of sowing wild oats, Miss Sally prudently considers that half a loaf is better than no bread. To be out of harm's way he prudently thinks is something too, and therefore he accepts your brother's offer. Brass, Mr Swiveller is yours.'
'I am very glad, sir,' said Mr Brass. 'Very glad indeed. Mr Swiveller, sir, is fortunate enough to have your friendship. You may be very proud, sir, to have the friendship of Mr Quilp.' Dick murmured something about never wanting a friend or a bottle to give him, and also gasped forth his favourite allusion to the wing of friendship and its never moulting a feather, but his faculties appeared to be absorbed in the contemplation of Miss Sally Brass, at whom he stared with blank and rueful looks, which delighted the watchful dwarf beyond measure. As to the divine Miss Sally herself, she rubbed her hands as men of business do, and took a few turns up and down the office with her pen behind her ear.
'I suppose,' said the dwarf, turning briskly to his legal friend, 'that Mr Swiveller enters upon his duties at once. It's Monday morning.'
'At once, if you please, sir. By all means,' returned Brass.
'Miss Sally will teach him law, the delightful study of the law,' said Quilp. 'She'll be his guide, his friend, his companion, his Blackstone, his Coke upon Littleton, his young lawyer's best companion.'
'He is exceedingly eloquent,' said Brass, like a man abstracted and looking at the roofs of the opposite houses, with his hands in his pockets. 'He has an extraordinary flow of language. Beautiful, really.'
'With Miss Sally,' Quilp went on, 'and the beautiful fictions of the law, his days will pass like minutes. Those charming creations of the poet John Doe and Richard Roe, when they first dawn upon him, will open a new world for the enlargement of his mind and the improvement of his heart.'
'Oh, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful indeed!' cried Brass. 'It's a treat to hear him.'
'Where will Mr Swiveller sit?' said Quilp, looking round.
'Why, we'll buy another stool, sir,' returned Brass. 'We hadn't any thoughts of having a gentleman with us, sir, until you were kind enough to suggest it, and our accommodation's not extensive. We'll look about for a second-hand stool, sir. In the meantime, if Mr Swiveller will take my seat and try his hand at a fair copy of this ejectment, as I shall be out pretty well all the morning.' 'Walk with me,' said Quilp. 'I have a word or two to say to you on points of business. Can you spare the time?' 'Can I spare the time to walk with you, sir? You're joking, sir. You're joking with me,' replied the lawyer, putting on his hat. 'I'm ready, sir, quite ready. My time must be fully occupied indeed, sir, not to leave me time to walk with you. It's not everybody, sir, who has an opportunity of improving himself by the conversation of Mr Quilp.' The dwarf glanced sarcastically at his brazen friend, and, with a short dry cough, turned upon his heel to bid adieu to Miss Sally. After a very gallant parting on his side, and a very cool and gentlemanly sort of one on hers, he nodded to Dick Swiveller and withdrew with the attorney. Dick stood at the desk in a state of utter stupefaction, staring with all his might at the beauteous Sally, as if she had been some curious animal whose like had never lived. When the dwarf got into the street, he mounted again upon the window-sill and looked into the office for a moment, with a grinning face, as a man might peep into a cage. Dick glanced upward at him, but without any token of recognition, and long after he had disappeared, still stood gazing upon Miss Sally Brass,